Okie dokie. Well, welcome everybody to our fireside chat with David Eagleman. This is a very exciting one for us, and we're delighted to have you with us. Just a little bit of a starter. I know we've got customers on the call, but we've got lots of new people as well. So I'm just going to start by saying a little bit about ProQuo, and then I'll introduce David and what we're going to talk about today. I am going to take silence as compliance. So
great.
Carry on. So ProQuo exists to help marketers make the right decisions for their brands. We've got all sorts of marketing experience here. You know, we've worked on brands, we've built them, we've guided them for years, which has helped us to identify the gap. There's lots of fractured solutions in the market that solve loads of different problems for marketers, but there isn't one single place that can help you through all of your end-to-end marketing decisions. So we do that by looking at how people feel about your brand, by measuring the subconscious. This way you get a very sort of predictive understanding of how people are going to behave, which then allows you to make the right decisions for your brand, whether that's, you know, anything from the brand strategy that you're working on at the moment to the marketing activities that you're planning and executing, or even then understanding the impact and of those activities and whether or not the money you've spent has gone to the right place. So that's kind of just a little quick nugget about us. There's lots of ways that we can help you on the call to grow your brands as well. And that's why we have David Eagleman here with us today. We aim to give you guys an understanding of how best to harness creativity and innovation for your marketing, how best to balance them, how best to use them. So David is a member of our advisory board who exists in general to guide and champion us here at ProQuo. He is somewhat of a celebrity to anyone who doesn't know him on the call already. He's a neuroscientist and author. He teaches neuroscience actually at Stanford. He's a New York Times best-selling author, some of which his books I've read, which are fantastic. And he's got sort of scientific specializations coming out of his ears, but they're things like time perception and brain plasticity and all sorts of things that we won't get into lest all of our brains explode. So it's lovely to have you. Thanks for being with us, David.
Great. Lovely to be here, Saoirse.
Brill. Well, I reckon we just get into it then.
Great.
David, it would be great to hear from you a bit about how these concepts of creativity and innovation are used in the natural world. When we first spoke about this, I talked to you about bees, which I think was a probably very reductive way of understanding this whole 80-20 concept. Perhaps you'd like to just talk a little bit about that and we can let the conversation flow.
Yeah, I mean, the general story is that animals all have a balance of exploration and exploitation, which just means that they spend 80% of their time exploiting what they already know and 20% of their time exploring new things. And this is true across the animal kingdom. And it's because the world's always changing. And so, you know, you learn up an internal model of what's going on and you spend most of your time taking advantage of that, but you always have to keep exploring. And obviously the reason this matters for us for this conversation is because every company has to do exactly the same thing. You think, okay, look, we understand our market, we know exactly what we're doing here, but it is absolutely critical to build creativity into companies so that they can continue to evolve and change. And you know, many companies that we know have changed quite enormously through the years. You know, Hermes started off as a saddle maker company, and
no way.
You know, yeah.
Oh wow.
And Suzuki started off as doing clothes looms before doing motorcycles, and you know, and actually you may know this, but there was a company called Odeo that was, I actually forget exactly what they were doing. They were a Silicon Valley company that was trying to do something, and they realized they wanted to have a way to do internal communication at work. So they made this thing where people could write short messages to each other. And actually they spun that off, and that was Twitter. That became Twitter, which the original company, no one even remembers what they were doing. But the point is, they were nimble, they were they were constantly changing around, doing stuff. So this is something that characterizes good companies that they're making these changes all the time. And of course, what we find often, probably more often, is that companies don't change and they don't adapt, and then they go the way of the mastodon. So companies like like Blockbuster, for example, simply didn't react to streaming fast enough. And if anyone here is old enough to remember, there was a time when Blockbuster was that was like the place you went, and they had an opportunity. They could have kept pivoting fast enough to maintain their pole position, but they didn't do it. And BlackBerry phones, again, if people are old enough to remember that, they, with the physical keyboard, a lot of people really liked the physical keyboard because you could kind of type in your pocket and so on. But as a result, they held on to the right idea too long instead of pivoting. Anyway, so this is the sense in which companies need to constantly figure out how to innovate and be creative.
I think that's fascinating. I mean, just if I very quickly tell the bee story, just because I thought it was very illuminating for me when I first heard it. Scientists were watching bees in nature, and they were leaving the hive and going out looking for, is it nectar? This is where I really fall down on bees. I don't like them very much generally, although I do want them to survive. So they would spend, they'd sort of go around from flower to flower, and they wouldn't go to all the flowers they could see. They wouldn't go, from this one to the next one that was closest to the next one. They'd kind of do this one and then skip a couple and go to the next one. And so what scientists eventually worked out, it seemed like an incredibly random pattern when there was some really obvious nectar just in front of them, that they were skipping, they were spending about 80% of their time going to flowers that they knew were there, that were safe, that they could count on for pollen every day, every time. But they were spending about 20% of their time going to random flowers, just exploring in a completely random direction in order to see if there was a new source. And what happened then was it made them very resilient to evolution and changes in their environment, right? So if, for example, 80% of the flowers died, they would still have that instinct and ability to find more flowers. Whereas if they just relied on the ones they knew, they'd die. I just think that's brilliant for brands. I mean, that's such a clear framework, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's a clear framework. And my impression is that every brand knows that this is the type of thing they have to do, but then actually implementing it is tough because, everybody's running a business and you try to figure out how to sell your product and fundamentally there's this drive to just say, okay, look, we've figured out product market fit, and we're just going to stick with this thing that we're doing. And so to be creative as a company actually requires real effort. It requires, meaningful change to be able to do that. And so, I could talk about some of the things that companies, have to do to get there. If that's what we're, I mean, the main thing is that any company, every company, and by the way, I run a couple companies that I spun out of my lab. And so I know how hard this is.
You've been at the sharp end of this problem.
Yeah, exactly. And so, any company that wants to be innovative really faces, there's sort of a three-headed problem there. So the first is that the future is hard to predict. And if you look at, one thing that has always amused me is looking at world fairs and the way that they offer this bold look into the future, and yet they're essentially always wrong about this stuff. They predict all these things, but nobody predicts, the internet's going to come here, or whatever. The biggest things that change the world never get predicted anyway. So all this is to say that the future is really hard to see. And then the second thing that we all face is that a lot of ideas fail. So, out here where I live in Silicon Valley, there was the .com crash originally. And, and also I'm in biotech, and, way over 90% of biotech companies don't survive. These are big multi-million, billion-dollar companies that don't exist. And lots of, from New Coke to Amazon put out a cell phone, remember the Fire phone. And so there are lots of ideas that don't make it. then the third is that, even ideas that succeed can have a pretty short shelf life. So this is something we see all the time. Like when the Wright brothers came up with their way of doing wing warping to fly, everyone thought, oh, that was great, but they were replaced by the time they were introducing it. They were already being replaced by, ailerons. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But the point is, so the future is hard to see. Many ideas die, and even good ideas like MySpace. I don't know if you guys remember MySpace, but
that was Justin Timberlake's investment, wasn't it?
That was what's that?
Justin Timberlake. He bought a lot of MySpace, and then
I didn't. When I first moved to Silicon Valley, I went and toured the MySpace building. It was this huge building. It was very exciting, and now it's completely gone. So anyway, even good ideas don't last. And so the question is, how given all this uncertainty and the high failure rate, companies are constantly asking themselves, how should I do this? How far to move away from what we know is working? And so I think the answer there is pretty clear, which is to, you have to seek out the border of the possible. And the only way to do that is to try out different things, lots of different kinds of things, but to do them at different distances from what you have now. So some things are completely wacky, and some things are just little incremental changes, and you try all kinds of stuff. There's so many examples of this. One is car companies do this all the time. They have their next year's model, which is a little different, and they make concept cars that are completely insane, and they're not actually planning to make, Mercedes-Benz introduced this biome concept car, which is a car grown entirely from seeds, and it has zero emission fuels that flows through the car's frame. Yeah, it's completely wacky stuff, but it's cool because they're sort of setting a flag in the distant future. They're not actually building this, but the point is you fill this stuff out. And
I think with Mercedes, they're doing both, aren't they? Because they just released the spec for their electric G-Class, which is an absolute evolution on from where they are now, but it's a much smaller shift. And it's much more in line with what we can predict than a car that runs on seeds.
Yeah, exactly. So all companies need to do this. They need to be planning at all these different levels, because that's the only way that you can ever feel out the border of the possible, is by scouting to different distances and really trying it.
It's sort of placing, sorry, David, it's placing your bets, isn't it? It's deciding what size of bet you're going to take where, and how far a leap that is from your sort of core that you feel safe and has been proven to work.
Yeah, exactly. And you're exactly right. They don't even have to be big bets. Like they're things that you're actually trying, okay, what if we built it? What if we did this thing over here and so on? I'll tell you who's good at this is, for example, any designers, like product designers. I don't have one here, but one of my companies builds hardware, and what's super cool is that our product designer, industrial designer, filled up pages and pages of books and boards and whatever of all kinds of possible designs. And when I started looking around, I find that every good company does that. They have people there who are not afraid to proliferate options, to put out tons of ideas. And sometimes companies will come up with, let's say, a new logo, and they'll share, all the different logo ideas that they had. And it's quite a proliferation. And so, one of the things that companies have to get to understand, and this is hard sometimes, but, is not treating proliferation as waste. Because sometimes, if you generate 100 ideas and you throw away 99 of them, it feels like, oh, that was a little wasteful. But this is the heart of the creative process. And so,
because that kind of, if you're applying that to your marketing, then, I mean, you could spend all of your budget that you've got for this year on, 100 experiments of varying risk sizes. And if only one of them might pay off, but that, in terms of what you need, I think your CMO and your CEO would be fairly irritated with you if 99 of your experiments failed. So how do you kind of de-risk that? Is there any way of making that safer or proportional or something?
So the general answer to that is, A, B, C, D testing, you test lots of different things, but even before that stage, you've got when you're designing the ads, you make 100 different versions and then you winnow that down to 20 and you try those 20, or whatever the numbers are that work for your company. But that process is really critical, because we all, all of us think, okay, well, I kind of know what the ad should look like for our company. And the problem is brains always follow the path of least resistance. So you come up with what is already sort of there. And you say, oh yeah, I've got an idea. It should look like this. There should be a person, there should be the product, the person smiling. And that's the thing. But in fact, probably the most important thing that all of us need to do all the time is kick ourselves off the path of least resistance. And the way we do that is by this process of proliferating ideas. So Leonardo da Vinci, for example, was famous for questioning everything in the outside world, but he was also, he questioned everything in the inside world, meaning whatever he came up with an idea, he would say, okay, well, that was my first answer, so I'm not going to trust that. I'm going to make myself come up with a second, a third, a fourth, and so on. And this is a very, very important habit for us all to get into, is forcing ourselves to say, I'm not going to stop answering this until I have 7 things on the page. By the way, I do this in my companies. Whenever an employee comes to me and says, hey, I'm stuck, I don't really know how to do this next thing, I say, okay, cool. Come back to me tomorrow with 7 ideas for how to solve this. And it forces creativity rather than, reproductivity, because they're forced into new realms that way.
Yeah, I love that, because I think, we're talking about the 20% here, right? The 80% of what you're doing should be sort of what to be safe and slightly iterative. So within the 20, I love the idea of challenging yourself never to accept the first thing and creating that habit. Because it's true, you kind of go, oh, I've probably got a solution for that. We're all time pressured. We've all got 10,000 things to do. You can't sit and question every single thing you do and come up with 7 ideas for everything. But if you limit it to that 20% of, this is where I'm going to take risks, this is where I'm going to try and be innovative and creative, it becomes a lot more manageable to create those habits when you know that you're in that area.
Yeah, exactly. And, many of us run, small to medium-sized companies, but big companies do this explicitly. So Google, spins off these things. They say, okay, you guys are just there to do the really wacky stuff. We're specifically tasking you to not say, okay, yeah, we know how to do this and iterate on it, but you guys, this is the Moonshot Factory over here. And so to the degree that small companies can replicate that and say, okay, look here, Susie's going to be our Moonshot Factory over here. That's really, really useful. And, and by the way, when you look at any product, it's funny because, we all see products on the market. We say, oh, that's a cool product. But because I do hardware, I'm sort of interested in this. And so I've collected up so many examples of, okay, here's this hardware product. But if you're able to get to what actually lives behind that, they build so many prototypes that are totally different, and they're all, really different shapes and colors and this and that. And they finally winnowed it down. But that process was massively important to getting to that final thing.
I think that is fascinating. And I love the Google example as well. I wonder, is there any kind of way that it's best to split your work to get to that 80-20? Because you could do it so many ways. You could say 80% of my day is spent being safe, and 20% of my day, you could do that obviously by week or by month. You could say 20% of my team is based in innovation. You could say 20% of your total time. Like, is it best to do it time-based, project-based? Is there any rules at all?
I happen to know that Google has tried this different ways. They've done it with time, where they expect every employee to spend 20% of their time working on things that are not their main thing. And, that can be just super creative and wacky and whatever. But also, it's clear to all of us who run companies that some of our employees are, ideators and some are operators. And so it might make sense to divide it by people too, and say, look, Fred, you probably don't want to spend 20% of your time thinking about some creative. So we're going to give all that job over to Susie here, and she can do that. Yeah. I would.
Sorry.
No, after you.
No. I just guess you've got to look at your team and what you're trying to achieve and which kind of model works the best for you, whether you do it by time or resource or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
What I love about this model as well is that I think it will lead to brands which have much more longevity, because I think it enables you to be flexible, right? And adapt to what's going on and stay slightly ahead of the curve. So I think, we have a driver that's relevant. One of our 16 drivers is relevance. I think it really enables you to always, I don't want to say have your finger on the pulse, but like remain resilient to anything that might change in your category, in the world around you.
Well, that's exactly right. Here's the thing. All of us assume that we would be good at figuring out, okay, here's the border of the possible. Here's what customers want, that sort of thing. But in fact, companies fail at this all the time, because it's really difficult to find that border. And so it's very easy to go too far, and it's easy to go too incremental and not go far enough. And, all these companies that go out of business, it's because they just didn't go far enough. And by the way, it's possible to try to take too big a leap. And so, Bic lighters started making underwear at one point, and that didn't work at all. Or, I mentioned, Coke made New Coke, and that just turned out to be too far a leap and whatever. But and you see this, by the way, in culture too. I mean, take something like language. So Esperanto, you may know about Esperanto. It was designed in the late 1800s to be a universal language, and everybody agrees that it'd be awesome to have a universal language that everyone speaks. And this actually gained a lot of momentum just after World War II. 500,000 people signed a petition to the UN, but it proved to be just too far a leap because nobody wanted to actually learn a new language and so on. Anyway, there are a million examples of this sort of thing. And that's why the single critical thing for companies is to make sure that they're covering the spectrum and trying things out. You can't just cogitate your way through this and think, okay, that's exactly where we want to be, because you just don't know. The world's too complicated. So you want to find that sweet spot by trying out various things, whether that's in the way that you market or the product that you're making.
I think that's a fascinating idea as well of where you're permitted to do that more risky, bet placing within your brand. Because it might be, for example, that you're a brand that everyone loves the flavor of. Say it's McDonald's and the Big Mac, my favorite meal. If they took like the pickles out of the Big Mac, or if they changed something about the way that it tastes, I'd probably lose the plot, and I'd be like, how dare you, that was my Big Mac, my beloved, why have you done this? But if they changed the wrapper, or if they changed like the shape of the M, or if they did stuff like that and played around with it, I wouldn't really care. Is there any kind of way to understand what you should be messing with, what you shouldn't be messing with, or is it just a process of exploration?
It's a good question. I think it's a process of exploration, because if you look around at all different companies, the parts and pieces that they change, I mean, just look at cars, 40 years ago to cars now, like they're really different in terms of, I mean, some parts are the same, but the thing is that companies thought people loved, no one's ever going to not want the big fins on the end or the whatever. All that changes through time, but if you were running a car company 40 years ago, you couldn't guess what the cars are now, even though it seems obvious to us in retrospect. So the way they have to do is just keep trying and looking around and seeing what else is going on.
I think what's interesting about that process as well is that through that you then establish, what is your brand's core DNA? Like what's the spine of your brand? What must you not sort of change? What's really working for you? I think you wrote about this kind of concept in your book called Livewired, I think, which is what stays stable versus what should flex and what should evolve. And I saw a talk by a brand called Beavertown the other day, where their branding, I don't know if anyone knows them, it's like a beer brand. their branding is absolutely wild. Like if you looked at it, their kind of name is the same, but nothing else about the cans is the same, apart from roughly the artistic style. And when they talk about it, they say, we understand our brand so well. We live and breathe our brand, it comes from their enthusiasm about music and their enthusiasm about graphic design. And they have a shared vision and a shared North Star. And so because they're so clear on the heart of their brand, their expression of it can be really free because it's evident who it comes from. So you can see like the values and the characteristics must not change about their brand, but their expression of it therefore is more flexible.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. Although it should be noted that, companies can change quite a bit, sometimes because of technology. RCA, I don't know if anyone would possibly be old enough to remember this, but RCA made televisions, but RCA, of course, stands for Radio Corporation of America. And it's because they started in radio. And then one day, in just a fast move, David Sarnoff, the CEO, said, you know what, we're not doing radio anymore, we're doing television. They just changed entirely. Nokia, which makes the phone, started off as a paper mill company. And so, these things can, it's an interesting question. I only bring up these silly examples to illustrate that sometimes companies can be quite flexible and have to be quite flexible. But yes, I generally agree with what you're saying. It's nice if there's one very clear core thing and then everything else is getting experimented around.
I mean, I love that challenge actually, because I wonder how much of what RCA was as a brand they kind of kept through that transition, even if the product changed. I wonder if there was any consistency.
That's an interesting question. I might look into. Like some other companies, this is the last dumb example I'll give, but Nintendo started as a playing card company, and then they also made love hotels in Japan. Like this is what they were doing. It had nothing to do with Nintendo gaming systems. It's just, something that evolved over time. I actually don't know much more about how in the world that stayed one company, but the point is they were willing to evolve fast when different opportunities called for it. Yeah, I'm not suggesting this for anybody. And, my own companies, I don't want to imagine that I'll be doing something completely different at some point. So I generally agree with you that it's nice when companies have their central thing. It's just the point being you have to constantly revitalize it. You have to constantly experiment, feel out the borders and so on, because there are just too many examples like Blockbuster and BlackBerry phone that demonstrate to us that if you say, hey, I've got the winning idea, I'm sticking with this idea, I'm not changing, because we've gotten so much praise for this idea that I know it's the right thing, that just right ideas don't last.
And I suppose when you apply that to marketing, because lots of people feel that marketing is kind of the face of a brand, right? You're the interaction that consumers see. It's the first line of kind of defense. Any change you make or any bet you place or risk you take is really obvious. Like marketers, I think, quite often feel exposed because of the publicness of their risk taking. I think there's a beauty in it as well, because you can take very small risks very often. You're very free to experiment, but there is that sort of danger around failing very publicly. Is there anything?
That's interesting. So I'm not. I have a guy who runs all the marketing for my company, but so the marketers on this call might completely disagree with me about this because I'm not the one doing it. But I have often felt like things are too conservative at companies, often where they say, "Oh, look, we've got our colors and we've got our font, and these are our brand guidelines, and there's no way I'm changing that. Like, I don't want to experiment around that, or we always do it this way. I don't want." And my view, again, this might be because I'm an ignoramus about this, but I feel like, well, who cares? Just we're doing ABCD testing, do something completely different.
Yeah.
And it's tough sometimes to get marketers to do this, but I think I'm sure someone could give me a really good argument why sticking with brand guidelines is the most important thing in the universe, but I feel like at least I want to push in the other direction.
No, I'm totally with you. I think you have to always be willing to test whether or not it's the right thing to do. I guess that tying that back to Proco as well, that's why we have our creative lab, which helps you to kind of de-risk those situations. You know, you can put your ideas in and see how much budget you want to put behind something, like how big a risk is it? Is it really gonna throw you off track? Is there anything that you can do to encourage your teams? Because I know like stakeholder management is obviously very important in marketing as well, you know, getting everyone on board and deciding together to do the right thing. Is there any sort of tactics or plans or techniques to encourage people to, as well, kind of similar to your 7 ways to do it task?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that a lot of, you know, I feel like, first of all, this has been harder during pandemic. I think the creativity of the world maybe has gone down a little bit because, at least to my knowledge, one of the best ways to do this is to get everyone in a room together with, you know, posted pads, and you say, okay, guys, look, here's the thing we're trying to solve. Generate ideas, and many of you are probably familiar with this, but you know, everyone generates ideas. You put them all up on a wall. And the point is just the pure proliferation of options. Mm-hmm. And then when that exercise is done, you know, 10 minutes, whatever, then everyone goes through and starts looking for clumps and clusters and says, oh yeah, you know, this one over here and this one over here, they're kind of the same. And so then you cluster them up on the wall, and then you discuss them all and you say, gosh, you know, look, you know, there's this cluster of ideas here. We've never really explored that. So that kind of thing, I think of it as a real Silicon Valley thing. I don't know, maybe the rest of the world does that too. I hope. But that's a super great way to get a bunch of brains on the thing. Everyone proliferates individually, and then everyone talks about it as a group, and stuff really comes out of that.
I suppose just as you're doing that, going back to your earlier point, making sure that the option that you kind of come to as a group consensus at the end is not the path of least resistance.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly it. And so what you're in a sense doing is the whole group is acting like the audience out there in the world and saying like, oh, you know, wow, this is really surprising. Like we hadn't thought about this before. 90% of the people in the room hadn't thought about this idea before, but hey, that kind of lands. And then hopefully with your testing, it's you've saved on some budget there. Yeah.
Exactly. I'm just going to take a question from the chat, which I think is really interesting. From Carol. It used to be a maxim at Kellogg's that if anyone was going to innovate in their markets, it had to be them. It gave them that string to their brand bow. Is there anything in neuroscience that helps us understand why people gravitate to brands that are seen as good innovators?
Yeah, it's generally because the brain always is trying to balance novelty and familiarity. That's what it's always trying to do. It wants enough novelty that it feels stable and it can make good predictions, but it also wants the little surprise that comes from novelty, from innovation. And this is why brands constantly do their new and improved version, because it's not like people don't like the car that is offered this year. It's just that next year they want something a little better. They want something a little bit different. And we're always seeking that balance.
I suppose that so intuitively seeking that 20% to be brought to us by other people, isn't it? It's
exactly. Well, it's the thing of, if Kellogg's still looked like their boxes did in 1979, I would be bored with it. I wouldn't. Yeah, it wouldn't be. Right. I wouldn't see them as a company that constantly gives me little surprises. Oh, yeah. Oh, that's better this year, and so on. You know, software does it. Everyone does this. They come out, you know, MacBooks come out with the next version and so on. This is absolutely critical for companies to always be seen as doing the new and improved versions. Yeah. Yeah. So I would say it's not that people gravitate to brands that are seen as good innovators. It's that people gravitate towards little surprises, oh, I'm really familiar and comfortable with this brand. I love this brand. I know I love it. Ooh, and there's, oh, look at that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. Thanks, Carol. I think just kind of pulling this back to the marketer's day, I think there's so many different ways to apply this 80-20 rule in their lives, right? There's the strategic part of brands, like where should I go? How do I achieve my commercial objectives? There's the creative part where, you know, you try and make the bloody thing that you need to get out there, excuse my language. And then there's the kind of, is it working part? Like, are my bets paying off? when it comes to the strategy part, I think it's really interesting how you can do that 80-20, because it seems to me that there's a few different ways you can do it. So say you need to, your sort of marketing objective is to increase your brand's purchase frequency by 1 time a month or something. I think you can either spend sort of 80% of your time and budget doing all the things that you know that will get you to that increased purchase frequency, giving people the messages they want in the places they want. And you could spend 20% doing something completely wacky and out there to try and achieve that objective. Or you could in fact take it back from the marketing objective to the commercial objective and say, oh, but we need to increase sales by X% this month. What's a completely different way that does not sit by this, that we can invest that budget to explore new ways? I suppose that probably depends on your marketing company and your structure and things like that, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, the main thing I would say, I would just addressing what you said about, take 20% of your money and stick it towards totally wacky stuff. It's not quite that. What you want to do is take your 20% and cover the spectrum from incremental to radical. You want to cover that spectrum, because then you do the testing and you find, whoa, this ad over here actually works really well. And none of us kind of thought that was the border of the possible, but there it is. And then you experiment around that, and then you experiment around the next thing and so on. So,
that's brilliant.
And so So one of the exercises that I think is really important for companies to do, and again, it's hard because everyone's stuck at home now, but maybe you can do this on a meeting. You get the marketers together and you specifically say, okay, what's something we can do with our ads that's an incremental improvement? Okay, great. What if it's something that was a little wackier? What if something that's even wackier? What's the wackiest ad we could possibly think of? You cover that, and then you do the ABCDE testing with that.
I honestly, that's such an important point, I think, because you take that budget and time that you've got and you split it 3 or 4 ways, whichever is whatever you can do, whatever you can handle. And you do kind of a small, a medium, and a big, or you look for a spread of risk sizes and sort of distance from your core safety to understand.
Exactly.
And then you judge the success of those, you monitor them, and you understand which one of those really paid off. So that by the time you get to the next sort of thing that you do, you understand, right, I was about at a 25% from my distance, from my core when things work best. What else can I do in that region, and how else can I explore that?
Yeah, that's right. And how can you explore around that? Exactly right. And ideally, you've got, let me just call it, even though it's a different term, you have like 20% month over month growth, by which I mean growing in this direction, like, oh, well, I did a little wackier and so on. Yeah, you're growing each year in some direction. And that's, again, exactly what product advertising always does. It's always evolving in some direction. Yeah.
Is there anything you can do? I suppose one part of this innovation will be dictated by the category that you're in. So in some categories, it will be much harder to take bigger leaps, and it will be much easier to take smaller, and vice versa. Is there any way that you can sort of watch your competitors, and understand from their performance how big the risk you can take is? Something might be painful for one of them.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, it's super important to keep an eye on what competitors are doing. The problem is people often feel like, oh gosh, that's working, so I'm going to kind of follow in the wake. And the problem is, if you really want to stand out, you have to do something that's different. Have you guys seen? I don't know if you have it in England. This liquid death. Have you seen this? So yeah. Okay. So it's like a beer can. It's called Liquid Death. It's got a skeleton on whatever, but it's water. It's water. And the idea is people can drink it at a party and they kind of look cool. They look like they're drinking a beer or something. It's the wackiest thing you've ever seen, but it's really caught on. But obviously the way they got there was not by saying, hey, what are our water competitors doing? Oh, they're making lovely things with some flowers or something. They said, let's just go off in a totally different direction and carve out our own territory that way. So I think that's just as important to see where the paths are, so you know how to break from the paths.
And I guess that then comes down to what kind of brand are you, and what's your kind of appetite for that differentiation? Because that is, but like Liquid Death, the the water company. Let me just show everyone really quickly. This is what liquid death looks like. So this is just water. So it is bananas, how crazy it looks. You can be a fast follower, or you can be, a true disruptor. And they've gone for the true disruption, maybe because they did place a few bets and they realized they had, license to go a long way. Whereas for some people, it might be right to innovate a little bit incrementally, in a way that has been sort of shown to work before.
Yeah, that's right. And, so for each company, it's going to be pretty different about what you can do. But for sure, if you can do what Liquid Death did, which is, very successful, if you can break away from the packs, you're not doing exactly the same thing that everyone else is doing. That's the way that any company actually makes it.
And then I suppose it's the understanding of where within your brand you should go further, like they have. So for example, their product, the actual contents of that can, I imagine it's just water. It's not very water at all. It's just water. And maybe their distribution model isn't very daring, but what they've really rolled the dice on is their packaging.
That's right.
Let's go mental on the packaging and the design. That's where they've rolled their dice.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah.
Fantastic. We had a few questions that people sent in before the session. Should we just run through a couple of those?
Great.
I think this is an interesting one. What is your top tip for giving structure to a creative idea?
I guess, I'm sort of repeating myself, but really the key is that there's never just one creative idea. The key, okay, here would be my top tip is, to be fearless in the face of error is, I guess, my top tip, which is to say, you're going to proliferate lots of options. You're going to try stuff out. Stuff's going to fail all the time. And that's fine. That's what it takes. And the thing is, I know from running a company and paying careful attention to the people in the company, everybody's afraid of failure. They don't want to say, oh, I tried this, I tried painting our thing like the Liquid Death can, and it super failed. But you know what, that's okay. You got to try it. You got to try 50 experiments like that to really become a big company. So there it is. Be fearless in the face of error.
I think it's also about, for me anyway, judging the success of it by setting up a really clear sort of parameter. Because I think what happens so often, especially within marketing, is you kind of try something, but you didn't set this is successful if criteria. This is the number I'd want to see, or this is the result I'd want to see. And so being able to then judge whether or not it was a failure is sometimes also extremely difficult. So I guess what I would say in structuring a creative idea is also just understanding what success would be for it.
You mean in terms of whether it has a long tail or something? Because typically, if you're running a bunch of ads against one another, and one of them really stinks compared to the other one, it's a pretty clear metric. But did you mean, maybe if you let that run for enough time, it would pick up, or
even just setting a metric that you're going to judge success by? Is this through increased engagement, and what does it have to be more than? Or if you're going to change your packaging, are you going to compare it to your competitors? Just making it crystal clear what the structure needs to do.
No, I take that point, because that's one of the things that's always very difficult is, product marketing versus brand marketing. When you do something wacky, it might actually be helping your brand, but on a longer time scale, but it's not selling stuff right away.
The never-ending balance of how do we sell things now and how do we build a brand for the future?
Yeah, quite right. Yep.
There's an interesting one here as well about how can marketers draw a line between addressing consumer pain points versus exaggerating or keeping specific fears for commercial gain? So for example, the one they've given here is weight management or diet industry. So is there a way of sort of, and I guess what kind of neuroscientifically is happening there as well is, how do you not, can marketing be successful without exaggerating people's fears?
If I've understood the question correctly, the key is that somebody who's overweight has all of those things already internal. One doesn't need to say, hey, here are the problems with being overweight. And you just don't need to, because they've got all that stored in their head already. And therefore it's quite easy. The bigger challenge is when someone doesn't know that something is a problem, but like various medical things that are more subtle than that. Maybe people think, well, it doesn't matter. That's not going to do anything for years and years. But if somebody's overweight and can't fit in her bikini and is embarrassed to go to the beach, she's well aware of that. Yeah. So I think understating things probably works just as well there.
Yeah.
If I understood the question correctly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Another one that came through, is there a difference between creativity and innovation, and which one is more appealing to people because of the way our brains are structured?
It's this, I use the words interchangeably. Typically, we think about creativity as something that humans do, and innovation is the thing that companies do, but it's the same thing. And what all creativity and innovation comes from, by the way, from a neuroscience point of view, is taking ideas that are already there and remixing them, bending, breaking, blending. So just as a 1-second side note, we often have this fantasy that somehow creativity is all about coming up with a brand new thing out of the blue. And actually it's never the case. I mean, again, just speaking from the neuroscience, it's all you can ever come up with is remixes of what you've got in there. And you've got this basic cognitive software running that essentially blends or bends or breaks things that have already gone in. So this is why, of course, for anybody in any field, including marketers, the important thing is to look at everything going, take in a big diet of what's going on. And then to say, gosh, what if I took this and I turned this upside down, or I did this thing and whatever. And then you come up with new ideas that way. But that's what the creative software is. It's actually very basic stuff that's running all the time. Everybody is running the same software. But that's how the world moves forward with new ideas.
I love that. The idea that creativity is constantly pinging in the back of your mind. What makes, do you think, then some people more creative than others, or more perceived to be more creative?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with just how much it's encouraged, both when you're a child and in your company, in your job. Do people say, oh yeah, Fred's always coming up with these things, it's great, let's encourage Fred? Or do they say, no, Fred, we do things a certain way around here and we don't want your wacky ideas? A lot of it has to do with that. And again, it also has to do with the structure. Like if you tell somebody, I want you to come back with 7 ideas tomorrow, or you hand someone the Post-it note and you say, okay, look, everyone here, come up with as many ideas as you can in the next 10 minutes. Then you're really setting up a culture, a situation where people can be creative. They're encouraged.
I love that, because it means that for our marketers on the call to kind of be more creative or feel more creative in their roles, it's as much about the environment that you set as the kind of attempt to beat creativity out of yourself as you can. Making sure everyone always feels safe to contribute new ideas, and in fact encouraged to.
Oh, totally. And this is to my mind, this is the biggest tightrope walk that companies have to do. Is the people at the top often feel like they don't want to be creative because they feel like, God, I'm just hanging on. We found our customer market fit. We don't want to change anything. But companies have to figure out ways to encourage this. I mean, so here's something that's easy for companies to do, is to just, constantly revitalize the workplace and make it new. So at least back in the world where we had physical spaces that we shared, change things up a lot. As people probably know, a lot of companies in Silicon Valley do this wacky stuff here. They put, like a slide and balls and things and for people to play and so on. I think that's actually quite useful, because you do these things just for fun's sake, and people have this opportunity to try things out in all kinds of new ways. in the world of Zoom, my company does this by playing games once a week. We, get together, we do cell phone scavenger hunts around our houses. We do all kinds of fun, crazy stuff. But the idea is simply to set a culture, an environment where that's part of the shtick. It's part of the fun.
I love that, because it kind of goes back to your point about how creativity is mixing new ideas together. So you don't need to change where you work. You just need to give people varied inputs to kind of mesh together in their minds.
Exactly. And just really setting up the culture where failure is expected. I mean, if you look at something like, people are probably familiar with James Dyson, and he's an inventor. There's all these great Dyson products. He invented the bagless vacuum cleaner after 15 years and 5,000 prototypes. That's how long it took him to do this. And of course, Edison, it took, 1,800 tries to get the filament of the thing. And, that's cool. Like, and SpaceX, everyone now is familiar with SpaceX and the way it lands its rockets and so on. But what I think fewer people know is SpaceX, the number of failures they had. And they did a wonderful job of putting out a video a little while ago showing all the Falcon rocket crashes, going up and exploding in midair, and all these failure after failure after failure. And I was so glad they put that video out, because that's what it takes to build a rocket that actually lands.
Maybe they could have had fewer rockets if they were doing more weekly games throughout the pandemic with their team.
I'll make sure Elon knows that. Yeah,
exactly. We'll let them know. And I love that idea from a few minutes ago, that innovation is kind of the output of creativity almost. Creativity is the process and innovation is the result. It's lovely. Another question from the chat. You said brains follow the path of least resistance. How do you break the behavior of people always going to the big brand in the market?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's the challenge every small brand faces. And that's why. So Liquid Death is an example of going so far that that you grab attention, and something like that has to be the case. I mean, every brand that's the small brand does this kind of thing. They say, hey, why would you go to the big brand when we have this special ingredient? But there has to be some special ingredient. And that's the thing that gets emphasized. We're made of not real meat, or we are eco-friendly, or whatever the cultural thing of the moment is, this is what we do, or hi, we're Liquid Death, or whatever the thing is that people say, oh, wait, what is that thing over there? Yeah. And this is why this is why small brands have to be more nimble and creative. The big brands can sort of get away with saying, all right, look, we're just going to do the new and improved thing every year, but we're essentially on a track. But the small brands have to jump around and try everything out.
So on the old 80-20 rule then, for smaller brands, would you say that it's a slightly different ratio, more like 70-30, and then as you get bigger, it tends to be less? Or is 80-20 true of everyone? It's just because of the size, what you activate tends to be different.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I would say it depends on where you are as a company. If you're still grasping around trying to find your product market fit, then it's probably going to be more than 20%. If you've kind of got a clear market, then you can then work on just simply expanding it. By the way, I see my picture froze there, but I'm still here. Yeah, so it kind of depends on whether you feel like you've really grasped your fit.
I suppose it's the equivalent of the bees working out that they want to eat nectar. They've got to do that first before they can then decide that they've got to go find flowers. Yeah,
that's right.
Amazing. Well, I have really, really enjoyed this chat. Thank you so much, David, for bringing us all your wisdom and experience.
Great. It's been a super pleasure.
Fantastic. We will be sending out some of the things that we've talked about in this afterwards in an email. So please look forward to the top things that we've discussed. And of course, if you would like to learn more about ProQuo, continue talking about this 20-80 split and how to de-risk your marketing, please click the link that's just happened in the chat. Otherwise, it's been a delight and a pleasure. What a nice way to end our Wednesday and begin yours, David.
Thanks. All right. Cheers.
Wonderful.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much, everyone.